Welcome back. I am Matt Lowry from the Getty Museum in LA. Preventative conservation encompasses a wide array of specialties, from environmental monitoring to emergency preparations, and worldwide organizations support and promote conferences on it regularly. But you'll rarely find Mountmaking addressed at those conferences, unfortunately. Be that as it may, I found it attractive as a subject today because of the premise that it's possible to get out on the front lines and create systems for objects on display that are capable of taking a hit to preserve our cultural heritage. Surely it's self-evident that there are few better opportunities to provide for the safety and well-being of objects on display than well-designed mount systems that reflect today's standards. What's less evident is exactly what those standards are and how they're defined. And that's something we need to work on. Oops. Let's go back. The most common definition of conservation is the prevention of loss, damage, or neglect. And it's hard to imagine any mount maker I've ever met not embracing that criteria in their work. Which leads me to the question, when is mount making not preventative conservation? I would say only when we neglect to try and do better to prevent loss or damage. There's an intriguing historical footnote tacked onto the success of the Otis Elevator Company, who remain the largest international manufacturer of lifts. Their business was rooted in the development of the best fail-safe braking system in the world, which they patented in 1861, and this drawing describes Elijah Otis's concept of that. It employed a mechanism to lock the carriage in place in case the hoisting ropes failed. And although that mechanism was rarely needed, having it there in a time of duress was universally agreed upon as being essential. In the same spirit, the field of mount making has the potential to get out on the front lines of preservation and prevention and build in backup systems similar to this in the work that we do. Certainly we hope they would never have to be used, but in times of duress, what looked redundant yesterday can look absolutely essential today. Unfortunately, times of duress do come around every so often, and if we haven't built in these backup systems, we're liable to get a rude awakening, such as this. The 1994 Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles County made that readily apparent to anyone in the vicinity. And unfortunately, this Cambodian statue of the god Vishnu suffered the fate you see due to the lack of backup systems. Appropriately enough, considering he is the Hindu god of preservation, he has been completely restored and is now back on view, firmly anchored to his furniture with a base isolation system underneath it. Is that correct, Holly?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Damage to precious objects is a hard thing to look at, something rarely seen, and really an unfortunate way to have to learn what not to do. Sharing this evidence with the public can be a dangerous enterprise, with the possibility it gets taken out of context and distorted for questionable purposes. But not sharing evidence of tragedies like this allows us to go about our business less informed and less prepared for what might be coming our way. In case any of you happen to be sitting there thinking, well, that's fine for you. You live in an active seismic zone. I'd ask you to reconsider, as earthquakes are not limited to the major seismic regions of the world. As you can see here, what was enacted upon the Washington, D.C. National Cathedral in 2011 came as a surprise to most people. Only now, starting to recover. I read recently that the Washington Monument was reopened this week. Fantastic, but that was almost 3 years of extensive structural reparations and retrofitting to make that happen. The USGS, whoops, let's go back, no, let's go ahead. There it is. USGS last week announced that Oklahoma was now ripe for a 5-point or greater Richter scale earthquake due to the extensive fracking in that state coming soon to a community near you. Anyone responsible for putting objects on display should keep in mind, Mother Nature is an unpredictable and dynamic host. And at some point, whether at home or with objects on loan, the work we do is likely to be tested in ways we can't always predict. And we do want our work to be able to take that hit. If you're still not convinced, you might consider these two subjects. On your left, this 15th century statue of Adam fell over in 2002 in New York City when a 4-inch, I'm not used to this computer, I'm sorry. When a 4-inch base underneath its pedestal gave way, resulting in the fragmentary damage you see here. In London, 2005, these 3 exquisite vases were knocked over and smashed to bits by a visitor who was coming down these stairs. Now, certainly, neither of these fine institutions, who I'm not going to name, could have predicted those events, but if we can learn anything from hindsight, it's to think like Elijah Otis. Prepare for what you can't control, using ingenuity and dedication, with all means available. On a positive note, after our meeting at the Smithsonian Museums in 2010, Shelley Euler, Suzanne Genzica spearheaded an effort to have the papers presented there published in the Journal of the American Institute of Conservation, which came to fruition in 2012 with this edition. Many, many thanks to their dedicated efforts and to the AIC for recognizing the relevance of the work presented there and publishing it for the broader community. Thank you, Shelley. If you don't have a copy of this, I can't strongly urge you enough to write to the AIC and request one. The articles written in it are well done, illuminate some wonderful mounting systems, and address some of the same topics that I'm trying to deal with today and that have been dealt with today. It also wouldn't hurt our standing for the AIC to see continued interest in this edition. So in the spirit of prevention, and perhaps a little help from Vishnu, I'd like to propose that we take a step towards investigating standards befitting the irreplaceable objects in our care. Fortunately, existing standards in the fields of structural engineering and conservation are readily available, time-tested, and directly relate to what we do. When I cross-reference between the standards in those fields, the most striking deviation that I see in what we do is such a common practice, such a time-honored tradition, that it continually flies beneath the radar. and that is friction fit mounts. So if I could choose a place to start, I'd say, let's put an end to friction fit. If we're going to set any standards at all, rationalizing our methods with what's most convenient has got to be a thing of the past. Why not provide the same amount of attention to how the mounts are secured as to what they hold secure? Threaded anchors are really a simple solution for most circumstances where friction fit is still used. Most of those are post mounts, which typically get jammed into some friction fit hole in a build-up deck or backboard. The beauty of this design, which I didn't come up with, but do appreciate to the nth degree, is that it's an easy surface mount. Now, I made some issue before out of the fact that Vincent didn't have access underneath the deck, and we're always clamoring for access underneath our display surfaces so we can get up there and put hardware. But with this, you don't necessarily need that. You drill a hole and tap it. You can drive this thing in, thread it in. It's not going anywhere. And with the assistance of that set screw and the collar, you can mechanically lock your post mount down. If you're displaying something on a backboard or even a ceiling, you can divot the post as it enters that hole and then drill out the divot in order to embed that set screw in the post, getting an even more positive lock on your mount. Providing a continuous connection between mount and furniture ensures a backup system in the work we do, whatever that cause might be of duress that's coming our way. And if they're made with some care, the visual presence of it, see here, can actually act as a transition between mount and display surface. Lately, we've begun to more or less mass produce these in regular sizes, having them ready, and growing in inventory as we make more and use and reuse the ones we've made with different mounts. Okay, these anchors are nice, but they bring up a valid point. They're not available off the shelf. And we make them on an engine lathe, which most people don't have access to, which potentially puts them out of reach. A few months ago, we loaned numerous objects to a traveling exhibition that included mounts incorporating these anchors. And we sent out detailed mount instructions to all of the borrowing venues. And Bob Hellier at the Tampa Museum wrote back to ask where he could get these for his own collection. After mentioning to him that we made them on an engine lathe, I got kind of sad to think, that his opportunity to put these into use was so limited. And so I started thinking, how can you make these with parts off the shelf? And so here's one way of looking at one method of doing that. Good old McMaster car. I ordered some set screws, 1 inch in length. This is 1/4 thread. And some locking collars. This is a 3/16 ID. Drilled an 1/8 inch hole through the 1 inch set screw and then bored out the 3/16 hole in the locking collar. And the reason I mean, you can get locking collars with 1/4 inch holes, no problem, but they do get a bit bulky. And one must keep in mind that these anchors remain visible, so there's an aesthetic component here. Trying to replicate what we do on a lathe where we can dial in anything we want. And it worked out quite well. I'm using a step drill, which I would recommend to do this in order to keep that hole centered, because it looks a bit odd when the hole drifts off center. But I used steel to maximize strength, and after drilling out the locking collar, joined the two together and packed the set screw hole in the collar with some modeling clay and then brazed them together. Once they were brazed together, extended the threaded hole in the collar to penetrate the 1/4-28 shaft, and then retapped that hole for the set screw in the collar. Once it was cleaned up and the outer edge was beveled down, the proportions of it closely resembled what we make on our lathe. And I found it quite acceptable, satisfying. In fact, certainly all of its mechanical aspects are functional, and I think aesthetically it fits the bill. Eventually I tried this with 3/8 stock and 1/2 inch as well. And I was able to hold the proportions fairly true without sacrificing strength. So thanks to Bob Hellier, who couldn't be here today. I hope this is found useful by some of you, and maybe there are other even better ways of approaching this. We do have a wonderful history of displaying art to draw on for our own needs, and therein some truly inspiring examples of the standards that I would hope Mountmaking might pursue. Flaminio Bertoldi's statue of Liberty Enlightening the World stands as an excellent example. Certainly her conservation treatments over the years have been extensive and kept her in marvelous shape. But the internal structure that holds her up is a marvel of ingenuity and preparedness that addresses the same issues we face. The statue's internal framework is anchored by tie rods that go deep into its base, which in turn is keyed into the historic battlements of the island. The veneer is a stretched skin design that is now commonly used in aircraft manufacturing, but was novel at the time. And it's pinned to a skeletal frame designed by Gustave Eiffel, who happened to factor in an isolation effect for the arm, which I read can move up to 5 inches to relieve stress at the joint in order to provide a backup system for the winds in New York Harbor, which can occasionally gust up to 100 miles an hour. The same standards that we're only now trying to establish for collections and display were in use in dynamic and inventive ways over 100 years ago. I take it as an inspiration and hope we can incorporate these same types of standards in the works we do. Today we can ask the question, what's the point of anchoring an object to a base that's not anchored itself? But this is the most common practice worldwide and rarely questioned until damage occurs. If the standards of structures visible in the work of Eiffel had been in place here, this would never have happened. So, it seems to me that adopting the principles of preventive conservation for Mountmaking is a process that's already begun, and this forum is a testament to that fact. And although one could argue both sides of whether Mountmaking has a part-time or full-time relationship with preventative conservation, I would say that the former is really more a thing of the past, and the latter our road to the future. I hope you'll agree that with this approach, we can continue to add to each other's better understanding of what we do in ways that are innovative, imaginative, and most of all, well-informed. Thank you.